We've got a lot of last-minute joiners, so welcome to the Human Rights Protocol Considerations session, the IETF 110 meeting. It's going to be a really good meeting, but we have 2 hours. We have 2 great talks, and we have 2 drafts to discuss. So we're going to not delay any further and go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick introduction to Hrpc on behalf of me and my co-chair, Aubrey Doria, who's also on the line. So if you'll bear with me, this is roughly how we're going to divide up our 2 hours together. At the end, we have quite a chunk for AOB because there's been some list activity maybe in the last 6 weeks that kind of goes beyond our current work. It talks about some possibilities. So we wanted to make sure we left time for that, and Aubrey's going to chair that section. Yep. I need to inform you all of the note well for this meeting. What applies for all IETF scheduled session applies to this session as well, even though we're in the IRTF. The first one that's important to note within the note well is on intellectual property. And then the second part of the note well that we wanted to highlight specifically is the code of conduct that also includes issues around personal information. And also on that note, just to remind you that this session is recorded. It'll go up on YouTube next week or before. So please consider these things. In the IRTF, so the Human Rights Protocol Considerations Research Group is part of the IRTF, and we, along with the other research groups, support the IRTF in its focus on longer-term research issues that are related to the internet. And then specifically, I'll get into it later, but we are looking at human rights impacts in both directions. We are conducting research. Our drafts represent information that can be useful. We're not developing standards here. And we often then take this to mean we also want to invite research being done elsewhere outside the IRTF to come into the IRTF where it's relevant, as you'll see with the 2 presenters from today. So within the IRTF, we have this research group that's been chartered for a few years now to look at how protocols strengthen or might put in danger, actually threaten human rights. And we take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR as our baselines for those standards. And our objective specifically in our charter is just to first, establish and expose the relationship between protocols and human rights. We focused, we have one RFC out, 8280, which looks at all of the UDHR, but specifically in our charter, we are concerned with the right to express oneself and the freedom of assembly and association. We also are working on guidelines as it's been requested of us and as it is helpful to help with protocol development so that human rights are enabled and not threatened. And then we also work both inside the IRTF and IETF technical community, and then also sort of outside this space to sort of bridge the technical community and other spaces so that there's an awareness in both directions that this work is going on and why it's important. So we do drafts, we do reviews, again, inside and outside. We've talked about this several times in terms of the AOB, expanding the scope, like how we actually want to do more than just drafts. So the last 4 bullet points are an attempt to capture some of those ideas. There's a film that was done some years ago that you can watch that sort of talks about Hrpc's work. We want to do more data analysis, which is what Sebastian is going to talk about with the Big Bang. And then, of course, Gershabad's work around guidelines is very much about, reviewing and analyzing protocols existing and otherwise. These are the major milestones to date. We'd like to add some more of these as work on draft association, draft guidelines, really starts to pick up. And the Big Bang is also, I think we should add Big Bang to this at some point with a date, because that's been a major milestone. And then just to remind everyone of where we are now. Good. We have 2 active drafts that we're going to talk about today. They're out of order for the way that we're going to address them in the agenda, but we're going to be talking about the guidelines for human rights protocol considerations that Gershpad's been leading on. And then we'll also talk about the freedom of association draft that Niels has been leading on, but that has had several authors. And a lot of, well, both actually have had quite a lot of list discussion lately. I'll just make a note that those on the list will have noticed there's been a great deal of activity this week. I would admit, as a co-chair, I've not been able to keep up with those discussions as I would have liked to, given their volume, but it's just because it's IETF week, and I've been in a lot of sessions, as I know most of us are. So not to say that we hopefully can bring in those conversations today. They've not been addressed by the authors, I know for sure, but we can also then, of course, commit to continuing those discussions on the list, and we'll get to that when we are ready in the agenda. So if you're all still with me, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speakers. I'm really excited about this. So Joanne Yates is Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management Emerita at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She's studied the history and contemporary use of communication and information technology in firms. And Craig and Murphy, the co-author of the book Engineering Rules, is Betty Freyhoff Johnson, 1944 Professor of Political Science at Wellesley College. He's the author of, he's a scholar of global governance and international relations who focuses on the long connections between intergovernmental organizations and industrial development. Together, Yates and Murphy recently co-authored Engineering Rules, Global Standard Setting since 1880, which I read, really liked it, and I'm really appreciative of the authors for responding to my request to have them speak today, because I think you all will also find it extremely fascinating from a variety of perspectives. So I'm going to go ahead and take down my slides and let Joanne get situated and turn over the platform.
Thank you. I'm going to share my video. Yes. There we go. Okay, so thank you, Mallory, for that introduction. And Craig and I, here's Craig, he's my husband as well as my co-author, are very pleased to be speaking to you about our work on standards in the public interest today. It's based on our new book, The Engineering Rules, Global Standard Setting since 1880. And this book focuses in particular on, it starts in 1880, it comes clear up to the present, and I'll get back to that, but it focuses particularly on private voluntary consensus-based standardization, so non-governmental. And if you think of it as, if you think of standardization as on a continuum with the market at one end and the government regulation at the other, private voluntary standards bodies are right in the middle, and they're incredibly important. They include things like IEEE standards making, ANSI, IEC, and ISO, and newer bodies like IETF and W3C. So this is where most of the action is on a lot of industrial standard setting, and that is what this book focuses on. So today, what we're going to talk about, I will start by giving you a little history about the birth of the standards movement, and notice the term movement because it was more than just happenstance. It was a movement, and then I'll jump up to the near the present and talk briefly about the emergence of IETF and W3C, and then I'll hand off to Craig, who will talk about standardizing around social issues. So the birth of the standards movement. The standards movement basically came out of the professionalization of engineers in the 19th century. So in industrializing nations of Europe, the US, Japan, more and more engineers were playing a bigger and bigger role, and they started forming engineering societies. they saw themselves as professionals. They wanted to be seen as professionals like doctors and lawyers. So they not only formed these societies, but they also sought ways to serve the public interest, because they saw that lawyers and doctors in some way tried to serve the public interest, and that was part of being a professional. So the way they came up with for making themselves clearly serving the public interest was through standards. So in the 19th century, there were 3 sets of standards that emerged these were before the first associations that were purely for standard setting, but they covered a set of issues that are typical even now. The first set was around steam boilers. If you look at the picture of the exploding steamboat in the lower left corner, there were horrendous accidents through the 19th century around steam boilers exploding and doing just terrible damage, killing many people in horrible ways. So it was clearly a safety issue that needed to be addressed. So in the US, a bunch of scientists and engineers at the Franklin Institute, which is a proto-engineering society, came together and they spent a lot of time doing research and came up with a standard for making steam boilers strong enough that they would not explode. And these ultimately made it into law and did immensely improve this problem. German standard setters also turned to steam boilers as their first activity later in the century. The second area was screw threads, compatibility issues. As it turns out, at that time, if you got a piece of machinery that was made by a particular machine shop, and you stripped one of the threads on a bolt or something, you couldn't replace it from something you had from someone else. You had to go back to the original place and have them make another one, because every company's screw threads were different. So first in Britain, the Whitworth screw was proposed as a standard screw by a mechanical engineer there. And then in America, William Sellers, who's pictured in the slide, came up with a better standard, at least the Americans thought, for the American standard. Both of these were fairly widely developed, and engineers and societies helped publicize them, but they were made by individuals, not by groups. So the next issue, the performance of steel rails on which the railroads ran, that became the really critical issue, where you start bringing together multiple types of engineers to work on the same problem, because you had to have mechanical and chemical engineers involved. You had to have mining engineers as well as railroad engineers. So multiple engineering societies came together and developed the proposed standard specs for steel rails that you see on the right. They're RFC. So this was the closest to what soon emerged as societies created solely for making standards. So we get the birth of both national and international standards bodies around 1900, sort of this big bang, and they all of a sudden came at once. The first national body was in Great Britain, founded by John Wolfe Berry, a mechanical engineer, a civil engineer who built bridges, actually. And they brought together people from five different engineering societies and created a committee with all of them. And they developed a set of principles about how to arrive at standards. They created the notion of technical committees in specific areas they set up, and they came up with norms such as you had to have a balance of stakeholders. So you wanted some of them to be from the manufacturing firms, some of them to be from the purchasing firms, and some of them to be unaffiliated with either. So you wanted to have all three of those types represented, and none of them over 50%. They also came up with processes that would lead to consensus and in particular due process that guaranteed that everyone's ideas got heard. They may not ultimately have been adopted, but everyone's ideas were heard. And this was very important, and it lengthened the process, but it was important because it helped achieve voluntary adoption of standards, which was ultimately their goal, to get companies, manufacturers, and users to adopt them that way. So, and this British body became the model for all the other national bodies. The other national bodies there was a little delay first, and then around World War I, a whole slew of other countries started developing national bodies modeled on the British one. But only 5 years after the British one was founded, the first ongoing international body was created by electrical engineers. They were at the cutting edge of engineering at this point, and they decided they needed to organize on an international level. And they had to come up with some new rules because it worked differently when you were in international than national. One of the things was they figured out you had to have delegations from each nation but you wanted those delegations not to represent the government. They were very clear on this and had big discussions about it, and it's all documented well. They didn't want governments. They wanted standards bodies to be national standards bodies, in this case, the electrical engineering body from each country, to say who should be the delegation. They also came up with the notion of one vote per country, which IEC still uses today. And the picture there is Colonel Crompton, who was the engineer who started this one. Now, with these two bodies, we now have the birth of the standardization movement. Standardizers formed a transnational community. That is, they were talking to each other across country lines. They weren't just being national, they were being an international community. And Charles Lemaistre was perhaps the head of all of this. That's Charles Lemaistre right there. He was a secretary of the British body from the very beginning. He was quite young at this point. And in that capacity, he convened meetings of the secretaries of all the national bodies for several years in a row so that everyone was exchanging views. He also was the first Secretary General of the IEC, and he kept that position. He was Secretary General from its beginnings in 1906 to in the early 1950s, right before he died. So he really was the heart and soul of IEC during that period. And here in this picture, you see him in the 1920s, mid 1926, I believe, leading a whole group of European standards representatives off a ship in a harbor in US where they were coming to attend two conferences, one an IEC conference, but the other one a conference to think about whether they needed a more general international body. The body that they formed would not survive World War II and is not important, but at this point, this was the first attempt at that. So these people, the leaders of these organizations, and particularly Charles Lemaistre, shared beliefs that standards promoted both national and international values, prosperity and national interests on the one hand, and humanity's interests and world peace even on the other. So we can see Sir John Wilkes-Barre, the man who started the British group, he felt that this organization would help them in keeping the trade of our colonial empire in the hands of British manufacturers. So that was a national value. Comfort Adams, who was the head of the American national body, he was worried about the post-World War I labor problems in the U.S. and worried about what the Russian Revolution happening in the U.S. So he thought the best thing that could help this is productivity of labor. If you increase it, the pie gets bigger, everyone gets more money. And they thought that would decrease the labor unrest. And he saw standardization as the key to that as well. On a higher level, Charles Lemaistre himself saw that the process by which they arrived at international standards was key also. Because to be a good standardizer, in his view, you couldn't just go for your own interests. You had to sink much of your personal opinion and work for the benefit of the community as a whole. And that he saw as something that would increasingly benefit humanity at large. So he had a big vision. Similarly, Comfort Adams saw that international standardization would help with the removal of a barrier between nations, and it would also help them to, quote, attain that lasting peace for which the world longs. This is right after World War I, and he longed for peace. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be, but they had great beliefs in the value of standards to do this. The final piece of the traditional standards system was put in place right after World War II, when during the war, all the standardizers were focused internally on national standards and military standards. But the minute the war ended, they met in London. This is a 1946 meeting you see here, to create ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, of which IEC would be the International Electrotechnical Commission would be a partner and sort of the electrotechnical division of ISO is how they saw it. Lemaistre was a key figure in figuring this out. He also, oh, and here he is, he's old and a little short by this time, so you can barely see him between two front row gentlemen, but he really pushed during this period on inclusion. So he thought it was absolutely critical to get all the stakeholders back in, both Germany's, Japan, Italy, and also to keep the Soviet Union and the other countries in its sphere of influence part of this as well. And IEC and ISO did this much better, actually. They did it faster than the UN did that was formed. They managed to bring everyone back in. So internationalism was a very strong value by this time. So now let me skip up in time, closer to our current era, and look at how new standards bodies emerged around the internet. Here you guys are, IETF. In the 1980s, as some of you will know, there was a networking standards war. And as various organizations were trying to set standards and all kinds of people were working on it, meanwhile, TCP/IP became the de facto standard because it was up and it was running and people could use it. So it became de facto standard. And that meant that IETF, which had been created in 1986 when DARPA spun off the internet from ARPANET, it helped create IETF to help keep tabs of the protocols. And that became the de facto standards body for the internet, which is very interesting because IETF was not directly influenced by these traditional standards bodies I've been talking about. It grew out of a completely different tradition, and it had a very different style from those. A very freewheeling style that contrasts with the men with their high hats that we saw in the pictures. And as you all know, David Clark articulated in '92 the manifesto, "We reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code." And that meant that there were some unusual characteristics of IETF compared to the other standards bodies. So IETF is open to all individuals, which feels very democratic, but it doesn't require stakeholder balance. So there's not anything structural that prevents one company from sending all their people to a meeting, for example. They value timeliness over complete consensus and over due process. The technology was moving too fast. IETF is global, but it lacked national representation, which had some advantages, but some real disadvantages. And in practice, it meant that for many of the years of its existence, it was dominated by Western English-speaking males. And one final difference is that there's lots of movement energy I've discovered in IETF. People are enthusiastic about it, but they're enthusiastic about the internet. The internet is what they see as helping create world peace, not standardization itself. Soon we get W3C as well. Tim Berners-Lee formed it. He was familiar with IETF and the traditional model and corporate consortia, which also came in during the 80s. But he created his own hybrid where he gave himself extensive powers. He strove for a more robust consensus and provided limited due process where you could appeal to him. So now let me hand this off to Craig, who will talk about standardizing around social issues.
Great. Thank you very much. I wanted to have a story that really starts around the same time as IETF and W3C, which is the story of how the traditional standardization system and then a set of new bodies got involved in things like human rights and social issues and environmental issues. And there's a weird thing because it really starts with quality management standards, the ISO 9000 series, which were established around 1987. ISO 9000 was the first time that ISO created a standard that was about a business process rather than a standard about something like compatibility of objects. ISO 9000, especially in the United States, tends to be mocked by a number of people. They're all good sort of jokes about how you can be an ISO 9000 certified high quality astrologer, and there are quite a few, a Buddhist temple, and there are quite a few ISO 9000 Buddhist temples, or a university like this university in Botswana, which was the first university, and now there are many around the world, that are ISO 9000 quality organizations. It's mocked, but it actually has an extremely important role in businesses, particularly in the developing world, where it's important for businesses to be able to show that they have quality of one form or another. Consequently, another reason for this picture is the Botswana University is saying something to the rest of the world. The final thing that's really important about this is ISO 9000 turned out to be a great moneymaker for national standard settings bodies. It provided a way through a certification and accreditation that these bodies, which had always had trouble paying for themselves, had a way of paying for themselves, even in developing countries, again, like Botswana. Okay, as a consequence of the ISO 9000 idea and of a second thing, and this is my political sciencey sort of thing, which is that around the same period of time, you start having the global manufacturing economy, but you don't have intergovernmental agreements to deal with the social and environmental consequences of this global manufacturing economy because the United States will not allow those agreements to be reached, starting really with the Reagan administration. As a consequence, for companies that actually were doing things that dealt with, supported social issues, environmental issues, human rights issues, they felt that it would be a really good idea to have standards where they could be certified for doing something that lots of other companies did not do. And ISO started to get into this business of finding standards based on ISO 9000 that would allow you to say, we do things correctly environmentally, we do things correctly in a social form. Oddly enough, though, ISO was challenged by many of the social movement organizations in these fields for not actually providing strong enough standards. And you start getting standards first in the environmental area, but then also in labor and human rights areas, again, starting right in the 1990s, that are higher level certifications, and a whole new standards movement around this. Alice Tepper Marlin, who's pictured here, is sort of the Charles Lemaistre, the guru of this. And in addition, finally, you get the United Nations system coming up with its own version based again on ISO principles. So you have now hundreds of different standards that are in this field. For a political scientist, one of the things that's the most interesting is that these standards have a kind of uncertain legitimacy. One of the things that we know from a variety of different surveys is that despite the fact that the standards that Alice Tepper Marlin's groups, ISEAL, which
Hey, folks. I think we lost our presenters. Unless that's just me. No, I think Joanna and Craig are gone, but we can wait for just a beat, see if they turn back up. If not, I think we're ready to move on. I do see Joanne here.
I would give them a second, and then we may just want to take some comments if we're there.
It's a little hard to understand you, Aubrey, but could you just repeat that? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking we could give them a minute or two, but also if there started to look like there might be some discussion, so if people had a couple comments to make, we could make that before jumping off. But they may be back now. I don't
It
know.
looks like they're back.
Sorry about
Hey,
that.
hey, Craig. No, that's all right. You can just pick up where you left off.
Where did we leave off?
I think there. What?
Oh, okay.
Wait, it's not the right window.
Elliot says legitimacy. Where you left off.
Okay. So I said that there are these new forms of standard setting by a variety of different groups. And one of the things that's striking about this is that there's a different degree of perceived legitimacy of these different standard setting organizations. For companies and for social movements around the global south, in much of the world, the standard setting that is considered to be the most legitimate is actually that done by ISO, simply because the ISO always assures through the balanced process that people from the developing world are able to take part. So we want to just conclude with some general things that we've discovered about voluntary standards and the global good. And we'll start by saying the general argument is standardization, as the old standardization movement, the Charles Lemaitre people would say, really has been good for the average person. But the second and more important thing, I think, for our work is that we've discovered that standardization has always had a social movement logic, that it's always been about people trying to change the world in the public interest. The process itself, and this goes back to the early ideology, really encourages people to act in the public interest, to pursue the ideals as well as the economic interests that they might have as individuals or as their company. And finally, if you have further interest, please go and find the book. It's recently out in paperback, and there's a discount of 30% during March. Thank you very much. Back to Joanne.
Great. Thank you both so much also for that discount code. That's gold. Just so you know, your video's off if you wanted to work on, I think might be a permission from your browser issue, but the queue can be open if folks have questions to ask.
Okay.
Sorry, Corinne, you could put yourself back in the queue. I did not mean to dismiss you. I clicked the wrong button. Brilliant. Go ahead. Go ahead, Corinne. Yeah.
It's Corinne. I'm a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I wanted to start off with thanking you both for this wonderful presentation. It was really interesting to see the IETF in what I guess is the larger arc of standardization. I had some specific questions about the assumptions that you make both about early and current standardization efforts in terms of it acting in the public interest. Mm-hmm. And I do so partially from my own PhD research on the IETF. But I want to start with the older standardization bodies that you mentioned, because you very much show how they are focused on world peace. But it seems that this is really a sense of world peace within a larger consensus that the reigning system of empire and that the reigning system of colonialism was one to be kept in place. And it also seems from different images that you included that all of the people involved in these early efforts seem to be white men.
Indeed.
And that, to me, raises a question of the extent to which we can even argue that these individuals and these organizations represented all of the public interest or very particular geopolitical one.
Yeah,
And
indeed.
likewise,
We talk about this in the book, and
Right.
more sensibly. On the one hand, yes, it was within their time, public interest as it was seen in their time by their class and etc. I think that's all true. But one of the things that's been true about most of the literature on standardization since done in the last 20 years has focused on how self-centered and non-public interested standard setting bodies are. And what we wanted to highlight in this book is that there really is a strong undercurrent of very positive values. Now, the values are in their time period, and we can come up with examples where they didn't live by them, and we can come up with great examples where they did. But
so the other thing that I want to add is the period that we talked much less about in this talk, which is from 1945 onward. This was a period of time when, because of some of the leadership of the ISO at the time, ISO was actually leading, at least in a time period, the decolonization of global governance. It was years ahead of the UN system, bizarrely. And ISO worked from the very beginning to try to bring in engineers, of course, from the colonies around the world before they became independent, which is a little bit bizarre. The gender openness to the degree there is a gender openness of this system, shall we say, is a lot later than the
international openness.
Than the international openness. And one of the things that I find interesting and peculiar, I teach at a liberal arts college for women, is that in the kind of post-1990s social area, much of the leadership of the social standard setting outside the ISO system, and some of it within the ISO system, is done by women. And it's certainly done by people from the developing world. And part of it's something I'm not sure is correct, but I have a hypothesis that part of the reason the ISO standards are sometimes considered more legitimate in many parts of the world is because of ISO is still more white and Western than perhaps some of the other areas.
Just cutting the queue for those who are in after Elliot, and we want to move on to the next talk, so let's take another 4 or 5 minutes if the people in the queue can keep it short. Go ahead, Niels.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for writing the book. So you write about the moral commitment of the social movements, and you talk about around internet and web technology and around environmentalism and corporate responsibility. And I'm very interested to see whether these are different moral commitments and for different groups. So do they optimize for themselves and their customers, or for a larger understanding? So this connects to the earlier question. And I'm also very interested to understand, do you see differences between consortia and former standards bodies and their interrelation?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that company consortia are much more concerned about standardization that is really focused on the benefit to the companies that are actually in the consortia, and there are no rules or whatever that are designed to make sure that is are balanced in any way. The older standard setting organizations at least have these principles that are associated with balance and the public good, et cetera. And they're not always followed by any stretch of the imagination. The details from organization to organization, from standard committee, from actual technical committee to technical committee, are things that deserve a great deal more research. And I guess that would be the place that I would leave off.
Yeah, we should probably let her go on to the next one in the queue.
Right. You gave some examples of standards that are defined that companies can adopt to show that they're kind of acting in some sort of public interest. Do you have examples of incorporating the public interest into more technical standards?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so there were cases where indirectly that happened. So containers are the most sort of the iconic standard set after World War II, in the decades following World War II. Container standards opened up the global market, right? And in the process of arriving at the standard, one company owned the IP for the corners that when you stack containers on a ship, corners hold them together. And one company owned that. And they had also lost out, actually. The standard that was established did not fit there. The length and breadth did not fit there, what they already had built up an installed base of. So they were losing players, but they still, in the end, they gave up their IP. They gave up that patent to the ISO and let them, the engineers, members of the technical committee, use it and modify it for the new standard. So that is sort of indirectly an example.
I think that the big example in the early period of standardization, that is until the 1980s, was simply the notion that every technical committee must include people, engineers, experts, whose purpose is to serve the larger social interest. I mean, that's the original balancing rule that goes back to these organizations that were created around 1900. That there's somebody sitting there, not direct representation, but representation by engineers to reflect what is considered to be the at the time the general interest. This idea was powerful enough that in the early part of the century, many very lefty kinds of people, like the founders of the Fabian Society and Torsten Vedlin, the American leftist economist, actually looked at these standard-setting organizations as places that were doing something that was more democratic and more in the public interest than what many governments were doing.
I don't know that, however, that there's an example that's as explicit as what you guys are doing now. No. So there isn't one that's that salient.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I think this discussion could go on for such a long time. I know the chat is going, and we've also got like other back channels. So we've just really enjoyed your time.
Get in contact with us directly, please do.
Thanks so much for the offer. We will share the link to this YouTube video next week, so folks that weren't able to register for the IETF can also benefit from the knowledge. So thanks, everyone. Thanks very much, Joanne and Craig. We hope you'll stick around. Sebastian is going to now present. So while he's getting his presenter self together, I'm going to go ahead and read out his bio. Make sure that's working. It was not. Oh, right. We're battling for screen control. That's fine, Sebastian. I don't need the screen to share your bio. So Sebastian researches the political economy of technology. He's a research fellow at the Information Law Institute at NYU School of Law and the NYU Agent-Based Modeling Lab. He's also a research engineer on the EconArc software project. He founded the Big Bang software project in 2015. He holds a doctorate in information management and systems from UC Berkeley. And this work was also done prior at the hackathon at IETF 110. So I'm really excited to turn it over to Sebastian. Go ahead.
Hi. Can you hear and see me and see the slides? Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. This is super exciting. And thanks for that warm introduction. I want to briefly say what is Big Bang. Big Bang is this software project that we're talking about, and then I want to talk about what we did at this sprint, the hackathon at this IETF session, and then talk about where we think we're going with this project. Big Bang is a scientific toolkit for studying collaborative communities. It started as a project to study open source communities, but it's really expanded, and now it's primarily used to study things like internet governance. And it draws from a number of different data sources, including email and Git repositories, and more recently the IETF data tracker, and especially recently listserv as a mailing list hosting platform. And then it combines those data sources with data science tools, especially those drawing on the scientific Python stack. So tools for entity resolution, social network analysis, natural language processing, time series analysis. We've got plans to include information extraction soon. So all the fancy stuff you think about with data science applied to these open collaborative community data sources. And when you pull that stuff together, you can do things like look at how different sort of online communities are connected. So this is one of the first studies done looking at a subset of the scientific Python community and the Wikipedia community and the OpenStreetMap community, and seeing where there were linkages between them. It started looking at, as I said, those sort of open collaborative communities, and then in 2016 it was adapted to study human rights advocacy in the IETF and ICANN. I think I clipped the dates a little bit, but you can see this. So this is the timeline of commits to the project. So then after 2016, it continued to be used as a teaching and research tool. It's made its way into a doctoral dissertation. In 2020, Article 19 funded some improvements to its gender and affiliation detection, and also the use of IETF data tracker data. And then this recent spike at the end is sponsoring the Big Bang Sprint in IETF, which has been a huge success. There's now many different institutions involved with this project, several different universities and NGOs. We get some questions about this project. So one of the questions is, why is this any different than the existing sort of data tracker exposure tools like Arco.com's RFC stats, which we love, but we're using a wider range of data sets, and we're supporting different kinds of research questions, because really we're supporting social scientists that are studying sort of standardization processes and/or collaboration, and we're also supporting computer scientists who are trying to develop new methods for using these kinds of data. And we're hoping that by having a community that brings these together, we can really do some social scientific and scientific advances, and also perhaps some advances in activism and advocacy. At the sprint, which was last week, we had a number of new participants in the project. There was a lot of work done on just basic maintenance, keeping up with changing software dependencies. We produced instructional videos for installation and usage. We debugged a lot of stuff that was we ingest a lot of different sort of unstructured, sometimes malformed data, so we've got to work around that. And then we introduced this new listserv data source, which is going to really help with applying Big Bang to other standards organizations like 3GPP. But we also did some science, and that's what I'm really here for. And some of the most impressive stuff was done by Nick Doty, who just defended his dissertation yesterday and used Big Bang in his dissertation. And he did an analysis of remote meetings on IETF attendance, which was so interesting that it made it to the IETF plenary yesterday. And then we also did some looking into how to track the influence and participation of different organizations in the IETF, which got the blessing of Yari Arco of Arco RFC Stats himself, and which we're really looking forward to doing more work on. So Nick Doty's work involves saying, well, there's a natural experiment going on with IETF meeting attendance in that the last 2 meetings were remote. And you can look at, speaking of, say, participation from the Global South and or, other groups, you could say, well, given where the meetings have been in the past, you see swings. So, when the meeting is in Japan, you get a lot more people attending who are from Japan, and likewise with Europe. And what's interesting is that with remote attendance, you stop getting those sorts of swings. Let's see. This was presented, in I think a clear way just at the IETF plenary yesterday. So you get a lot more people from Asia when you're meeting in Singapore. But maybe the legitimacy of the standard setting process will improve if we're meeting more on MeetEcho, maybe. The other thing that we were very interested in looking at was organizational involvement. There's this norm for IETF that people are showing up as individuals, not representing their companies, but everyone knows that that's not exactly the case. And so while there is some work already on which organizations have been participating in sort of drafting RFCs, we wanted to look at email, partly because that allows for comparison with other groups that don't have the same data tracker system, like 3GPP. So digging into that a little bit, we're looking at the domains of email, so everything after the @ symbol, which theoretically could identify somebody's organization. Like if I have an email at nyu.edu, that tells you who I'm affiliated with. But there are a number of challenges. So there's both, in IETF, a lot of people that have their own personal email domain. So, seb@bental.com. And then there's also generic email hosting domains like gmail.com, hotmail.com, and where you have many different email addresses associated, and those people are affiliated with many different kinds of organizations. So we developed a new metric that's based on information entropy, talking about the domain entropy of a sort of email domain, which basically has to do with how wide the distribution of emails are within that domain. And we made some. Oh, sorry. And that was useful for filtering out personal email domains, but we're still working on this generic email host problem. I'll get back to this in a minute. So in summary, we had a big success. We captured enthusiasm about the project from new contributors and users, and we found the broader IETF community really surprisingly supportive of the project, and that there's a big appetite for what I would call reflexive data science within the IETF. And an openness to giving, Big Bang researchers like a platform to communicate their results. And this is all super promising for the project. We've got a bunch of plans about where we want to take it as a software project, including, refactoring of a lot of the old code. It's academic code, and it always can be using quality improvements. And like containerization of the data exploration environment would be really helpful for bringing in other kinds of collaborators who don't have as strong a technical background and don't want to do all the hard work of basic configuration installation. But what we really want to talk about here is sort of the vision and strategy moving forward, which has been sort of emerging over the past few weeks that we've been preparing for this hackathon, and especially as things have really gelled in the past week. So, so putting on an academic hat, like I'm a postdoc at a law school, and but pick your theory of governance and power in internet standards. My go-to is Julie Cohen's Between Truth and Power, and the argument there is that network and standards, global governance, is circumventing the rule of law in various nation states, and the rule of law is what protects human rights. So we should be somewhat skeptical about the move to networks and standards, global governance, and that's of course a debatable point. But whatever your position on it, it is of interest that there's large multinational corporations active in these international standards bodies, and that their sort of foci of attention shifts on a multi-layered technical terrain, and that activism and advocacy for human rights has to keep up. And what we'd really like to do is translate these politically relevant research questions into quantitative analysis with Big Bang, and allow for automated and comprehensive view across many different standard setting institutions to support actionable insights vis-a-vis human rights advocacy. So, for example, identifying who might be receptive to working more with the human rights agenda, or actively monitoring shifts in corporate involvement and attention over time. So, for example, I mentioned this email domain analysis. So for the HTTP working group, we tried this metric and found, okay, we're seeing more sort of domain entropy for yes, many of these organizations, Ericsson, Microsoft, Yahoo. We get a lot of domain entropy, as you would expect, for generic email hosts like gmail.com and Hotmail, but we get the most domain entropy from google.com. Why is that? Well, this domain entropy you can think of as sort of like an area under the normalized curve here. So when you have many, many different affiliated individuals with Gmail accounts, many of them are very heavily involved. Those top Gmail account contributors are working for different organizations. There's one from Mozilla, there's one from Nearform, there's one from, many of them are acting, it seems, more in an individual capacity, and there's major differences in scale. There's nothing like balancing out the scale of their participation, which is why you see this sort of very steep drop. This is the number of messages sent, ordered in descending order, laid out over time. So it's a very long tail of low participants, people that send one message from a Gmail account, and then one guy with a Gmail account that's responsible for 80% of the messages from Gmail. Okay, contrast that with Google.com, where you've got a lot of area under this curve because you've got 10 or so people all participating at comparable rates, which is if you do a lot of data analysis like this, you see that and you say that's a very unnatural pattern. That indicates a kind of corporate strategy of involvement. So and this fits with intuitions, crucially, of people that do. I'm not particularly a domain researcher in this area. I sort of build the tools, but what's nice is working with people like Niels and Nick Doty and other people who do qualitative research in this domain is like they've got really strong intuitions about what this means, and you can say, oh, well, this quantitative signature seems to match corporate strategizing and involvement in an area that's different from individual involvement. And that's, I'd argue, quite interesting. So suppose we could track corporate power's influence with the IETF and where that's in friction with the norm that participants should be engaging in their individual capacity, not as company representatives. Now, and it's clear that there are people that are participating as individuals, and there are others that may be more detectably acting as company representatives. And what if someone were to present that at the plenary? What impact would that make? There's a lot we could do in terms of scientific analysis to say, okay, what happens when prominent individual contributors change affiliations? What happens when they get involved with human rights? Can they be brought in? So those are exciting research questions. Other exciting research questions involve patents. Where can we anticipate patenting moves by looking at this data, but incorporating patent data with email address data is especially the case in other standards bodies where there's more IP stuff going on. So I guess the vision is we get in-depth qualitative research and experience in the standard setting domains, which is really essential to making sense of patterns in the data. But then once we get a good-looking sort of signature of activity that's of interest, we can do a more active monitoring of standard setting activity and say, okay, this is where it looks like Microsoft or Ericsson is making a move here, and so ideally we could turn Big Bang into a kind of strategic interface for advocates engaging with standards bodies. Who's gaining power? Who's making moves? And if we continue to get traction within the IETF community, those results could be presented to IETF as interventions, and that's itself a very interesting, at the very least, qualitative probe, if not, effective advocacy. These are all issues on which I'm not an expert, but this is what we're talking about within the Big Bang community about where we want to move forward. So I think what we'd really like to see is we'd love to get continued support from NGOs to maintain a regular presence at IETF hackathons, and then use those hackathons to push forward the idea of a sort of a vehicle of data-driven advocacy within technical communities. Maybe submitting more data visualizations to the plenary talks to increase the profile of the project. And then also to do comparative analysis between different standards groups to inform scholarship and new approaches for human rights initiatives. That's the idea. If you'd like to get involved, there's information about how to join the mailing list on the GitHub repository page. The mailing list is probably where we have most of the discussion. There's also, it's also a good idea to reach out to Niels, who does a lot of the organizing around this, and you can also just work with the GitHub issue tracker directly. That's where we're having most of the technical conversation. With that, that's the talk. So I'm really happy to discuss it with you.
Excited to hear about the tool and how it works, but I love that we also got a huge dose of strategic thinking about why this is really important for the community. So I really appreciate that. Mirya, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for being here, bringing the data. You're kind of preaching the choir here, because I think the IETF is a community that loves data and loves to understand what's going on. And we have all these interfaces, but we don't make good use of the data. And we try a little bit better, but we depend on volunteers actually making sense of the data. So you're more than welcome here. Because I'm part of leadership, and we talk very often about what kind of data we need and how to understand what's happening. And one of the big questions we have there is usually how get new people involved in the IETF? How long do they stay in the IETF? What's their motivation to stay or leave the IETF? So are we a healthy organization, that is kind of future-proof in the sense that we get new people in and make them work in the IETF and make them have them to make progress in the IETF. So maybe that's a question that if you take that on, I'm sure there are a lot of open ears and would be interested in that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll make a note of that. I'll probably file some issues to make a note of those as feature requests.
Great, thank you so much already.
Anyone else want to jump in the queue? This will also, as I said before after Joanne's talk, that this will be online next week for others to watch if folks missed it. So we'll probably do a round of promotion to that HRPC list about that next week. I thought it was a really useful talk. And of course, your slides are up. Folks can, of course, interact with this on the HRPC list. I think you're subscribed to that, right, Sebastian? If not, they have your email because I CC'd you on the message to the list about this. And also then there's GitHub where folks can ask questions, add issues or things like that. So thank you. Thanks so much. Really appreciate you coming and talking to us today about that.
Thank you.
Super. So we're going to continue with the agenda. I just want to go back to it. We're going to now transition into talking about work that we have currently. So again, those are the two drafts, guidelines and association. And I see Gershabad, you are here. Do you want me to be controlling your slides or do you want to do it?
Actually, that will be great if you could.
Let me do that. For some reason, it's giving me weirdness around sharing my screen. So I'm just going to do a really quick refresh and I will be right back. Oh, you're going to do it. Okay, good.
I can try it. Did that work?
Perfect.
Yeah, is my screen available?
Yep, we can see everything.
Oh,
go ahead.
So yeah, this will be a quick presentation on guidelines for human rights protocol and architecture considerations, which is a draft that Niels and I are co-authoring.
And Gershabad, can I also I just wanted to, sorry, before you totally jump in, that Aubrey's the document shepherd on this draft too. So if you want to pause sort of at the end or at any time, like I think she has a few things to say as well. So just
perfect. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So this document sort of went into last call in December, but we received a lot of reviews and comments. So just to recap, this is a document sort of proposing guidelines that network protocol designers and developers can keep in mind to broadly be in line with human rights. And the document is practice-based and practice-oriented. So we want all the language to be aimed at people designing protocols. It is practice-based in the sense that a lot of the feedback has come from the people who put these guidelines into use and review drafts or drafts that they were authoring or someone else's draft they reviewed. And this is an update to RFC 8280, which had a version of these guidelines. So there were a lot of reviews, and while making this presentation, I thought I'd summarize some changes, but there was no easy way to. They're sort of all over the place. But I did send in detailed sort of responses to the reviews by Joey, Corinne, Fazana, and Bill. So please do check those out on the mailing list if you haven't. There's like we do need more additional work on, and this is something that was the aim, but perhaps we're not meeting very clearly now, which is all the questions will now be aimed at protocol developers and they'll be solution oriented. And as Bill said, so some of these guidelines still read and explanations read as criticism of existing practices rather than guidance. And there's also a very detailed review by Professor Sandra Brumman, which asked a lot of critical questions about the theoretical framework we've chosen and how we chose to represent certain documents. This is coming in the next version. And one of the open questions where, at least for me, it was hard to guess where the group consensus was on a section on attribution and legal remedy. And currently, in the last update, this was changed very close to what Farzana had suggested on the list. And there's been a couple of emails on that after the new update was pushed. And currently, I'm of the opinion of like adopting the text that Elliot Lear had proposed on email, which so just for context, the attribution / legal remedy problem was that if the right to legal remedy is something that protocol developers need to consider, and in case the answer is yes, then it probably becomes as a prescription for including elements in protocols where you can trace content to their originators, or all the content is perhaps linked to identifiers associated with the creative. And this, of course, runs very contrary to privacy and freedom of expression, and in that sense, other guidelines on that which are already in the document. So my proposition is to change it to what Elliot proposed, but I'm if there is still disagreement, I will let I would love to hear your opinions on that, and perhaps Niels and the chairs and others can also come in. So while this was in last call, I mean, we're still very open to feedback, and in case you want to send that to the list or step to the mic after I stop speaking. And there's lots of drafts that are having a human rights consideration section, and I may have, if you're one of those, I may have approached you informally for feedback, but still very, I mean, we'd love feedback, especially from you. And after the last sort of detailed review, which is Professor Sandra Brahmans, I think at least I propose that, and maybe the chairs can decide whether we need another last call or whether we're all set. So perhaps on that note, over to Avery.
Gershabat, and thank you, Gershabat and Niels, for sort of the approach you're taking to responding to the comments. Very much understand the approach you're taking of sort of trying to keep it within the particular mode of this is addressed to, you know, the developers and such that are using the guidelines. And I very much appreciate also the number of people that sent in comments. Though it did take a while to get people started sending them in. And I was very remiss in not stopping the last call after 2 weeks, in which case there would have been no comments. And finally, at some point, it was sort of, you know, gotten started by, I guess John Curran was the first one to say something, and then it started. So hopefully next time we have a last call, more people will jump in quickly. I'm of the opinion that, you know, you're really, really close. And in fact, I was thinking that I would be suggesting another last call at this meeting, because, but with a few things, and especially with you now addressing some of Sandra's issues, I think your next release would be the one that I would look to do another last call on it. And because there's been significant change and significant conversation, I would like to do one. I would like to do one that was short and force myself to actually obey the 2-week type of notion and not let it drag on for a month or more, hoping that people will comment. And what I'll really be asking is those of you that commented, you know, has it been dealt with? Are you okay now? But the thing I'd like to ask people to think about is some of the issues that have come up seem almost like fodder for a great new companion document that sort of discusses many of the issues behind some of these and goes into the great detail and the learning that people have gotten over the last couple years of using the guidelines and such. but that's something more for our later conversation than this one. But I do want to not burden this document too much by considerations that fall out of that, motivation on this document, that it is to be thought of as, is it usable as a guideline? We're not providing a guideline, so much as providing that. So if that's okay with people, and especially if it's okay with the editors, that's kind of the approach I'd like to take moving forward. And I don't know if other people have other comments, but I just wanted to get that said. And I really do appreciate the fact that you did not yell at me for leaving the last call open as long as I did. And again, thank the people that commented. Thanks. Do we have
Thanks
people?
so much, Abby. And I mean, glad as anyone else. I think during the last 2-3 meetings, there were no comments and feedback coming in. So glad to have received that volume in the past few days. I think the idea of going to last call after we address Sandra's comment sounds good to me. But I'll also let Needs come in if he has any thoughts.
I follow your people's lead. This is great. Thanks so much. I don't hear Avery anymore, but that might be just me.
It's the same here, actually.
It was me gesticulating with a closed microphone. Apologies. I said I very much appreciated your slide about how difficult it is to do the synthesis of these comments. I'm sort of been doing one of those in the background because it'll be a necessary part of the write-up that gets submitted, when this gets sent to the IRSG, discussing this is the document, these are the discussions, this is where it came out, et cetera. The group went through its process, the group went through. So I am trying, but I totally sympathize with you of sort of the difficulty of putting them in a chart, in a nice, neat boxes. But it's one of the things that I've been looking at as well. Any other comments? If not, Gershabat, again, thank you. And I turn it back to you, Mallory, for the next one, or because I see no comments.
There is one more comment. Farzana, do you want to jump in the queue and send audio, or I could just read your question aloud, which is that what are we going to do to resolve the issues?
So Farzana
sorry,
just asked if the text that he proposed and that Elliot Lear came up with is okay. And there will be a last call after we address the comments, but it would be great if we could make use of our session time to build a consensus around that text, because that part is particularly contentious. And as we all know, this is a research group document, so we all have change control. So if we all make suggestions, we can only make the document better.
Yeah.
Completely agree. If the question directly relates to the sort of attribution legal remedy part, then my proposal is to just adopt the text that Elliot Lear proposed. And if you have 2 minutes, then if there are any objections to that, then we can.
Certainly, we've got a few. It's good
We
to
do
talk about. Discuss them on the list in the meantime.
No, I think we're going to spend the time on it. So, Elliot, you're in the queue. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, hi, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. The virtual world that we all live in. I think the text that you're talking about is like the 3-word change that I suggested in response to John Coran. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, John sort of went to the zoo trying to address the concern that that he raised, and I was looking for the minimalist change that would accomplish the same thing. So that just as by way of explanation, the fewer changes, the better. If I can, as long as it's understandable and comprehensible to the reader. That was the goal.
Yeah, and it did come up whether the issue is relevant at all. I think it's useful to retain that text and change it to what you suggested, just because we shouldn't avoid the controversial question. So just that.
Any other comments? Thank you so much, Gershabad. Thanks, Aubrey.
I have a question. I mean, I guess I'm wondering on Farzane's issue. She talks about a meeting to resolve the issues. Hadn't planned on a specific meeting unless there were significant, a significant number of them that required that. I haven't the impression yet that we need that. So, Farzaneh, have those issues been covered, or do you see it not having been covered? And really, if you could speak up, that would be helpful, because really want to understand whether we need more in-depth discussion on any of these issues before this document. And that's where I also look to this notion of, does this document need a theoretical companion document that goes into deep depth on these issues? And that's where I have my question.
Yeah. I think my suggestion would be characterized, and I don't remember exactly what I wrote, we can look at that on the list, but that it should lead to future work. I agree with Aubrey. I think it needs, like, this draft probably can't go into depth on all these sort of nuanced debates. And we should have those nuanced debates in the context of another draft. It would be great if this document and a future draft were linked, such that, the research that we have done on the guidelines has exposed a gap on a certain nuanced issue that when we then follow and take, a deeper discussion about. I'm pretty sure that's what I said. So. Great. Gershabad is just asking a really direct question to Farzi, and if you want to continue in the chat, that's fine. But if the text proposed by Elliot is fine, we need to, I think everyone agrees perhaps, except we want clarity on your position on that before it gets adopted fully. And we can do that here, we can do it on the list, but that's, I think, the only remaining open question about that point.
It would be great if we could do it here, so that we don't need to organize an extra meeting, and that will save people a lot of CPU cycles.
Yeah, we can, but we need to be, we need to prepare for it. Yeah, the Farzaneh's comment was, I've extensively objected to that specs attribution, and people said I was not in the rough. So I like Mallory's approach to be taken into consideration of the first, and I'm certainly very supportive of that, assuming we have people that really want to work on that beyond the email messages.
If I may respond, so the responses of John Curran and Elliot were to solve that. So people have been trying to approach that, and we're now asking Farzi, who did not respond to that we do not want to say that because she didn't respond, she agreed. So that's why we're asking.
Yep, good point, and I'll keep asking.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yes, hello. Sorry, I managed to make this work. So I actually responded to that email about like Elliot and John Curran. To be honest, I don't know, I have been like very vocal on having attribution with the text that we have now is not optimal. It's not even in the interest of and uphold, it doesn't uphold human rights. But I responded to that. I don't know how many changes Elliot made. What Mallory suggested at some point was to resolve the text, to minimize and make it neutral. Perhaps something on attribution needs to be there just to reference to what is already in RFC 8280, and even better to serve as a pointer to future work. for our collective understanding of attribution. So I did not see that comment be implemented, and we still have that text about attribution and legal remedy, which Colin Perkins, who's actually in this meeting here, since 2018, he was objecting to that. I went and looked at the mailing list. Sorry, Colin, I'm talking on behalf of you. Yeah, you can correct me. But so I think that Mallory's approach in this email on February 2nd is very good, and I think we should just make the text neutral, say it needs more work, and then continue in another draft. Thank you. And I did not see that happening, to be honest.
If I may quickly respond, is that okay?
Please.
Yeah. So, in my opinion, the current text actually I thought would reflect more your opinion than it does a neutral position, which is like the position you expressed in your email is something I agree with very explicitly, that including attribution elements will go certainly against privacy and anonymity and freedom of expression, which are the other rights we've expressed. So very happy to incorporate the text Mallory suggested. I also think that merits inclusion as a general note, and is perhaps applicable to certain other questions in the draft as well, and not particularly restricted to the attribution question. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to change it to a more neutral text, but I was under the impression that like this text was in fact reflecting your opinion more closely and of the group. But yeah, I feel like we're getting into the weeds too much again, and if it is, I mean, I leave it up to the chairs as to how to approach this question in the meeting.
To facilitate the discussion, I put the text in the chat, and I think the addition that Gorshebal is talking about is towards the end, that explicitly says, considering the adverse impact of attribution on the right to privacy and freedom of expression, enabling attribution on an individual level is probably not consistent with human rights. So I think this that's there, and I think that was your opinion, right, Fars? So we can add a sentence that we should do more work on it, but I'm not sure that will make this document clearer. So I can definitely say we can put it on the work plan to do more work on it, but I'm not sure adding that to this document will make it clearer, but happy to consider any other text that you'd like to have in there.
Good to continue this discussion on the list, but we have Elliot and Colin, whose names were both invoked, who we should give a chance to speak, and then we should really move discussion to the list, I think.
Okay, so I just put the proposed change in the list, and there are two changes if you take a look, right? The first is we take out the word probably. I think probably is probably problematic, because either something is supported or it's not supported. And we can say may, as in the idea of this might be a problem that is worthy of further research, or we can say it is, in which case we can cite it, and we can take out the word may and just say it is, and that's fine too. The second part of this is that we didn't want to overgeneralize in terms of that attribution impacts all human rights. It's these particular human rights that we were talking about. And that was so those were the two changes. I don't think the latter change is at all controversial. I think the former change is easily resolvable as well. All we have to do is, if you can cite that, yeah, attribution is problematic, and I could perfectly reasonably believe that it is problematic. You know, if somebody can tie back to me some of the things that I said and that are illegal in a particular country, I could imagine that it's very problematic. So I think it just helps to be more definitive. I apologize for taking quite so long to say all that.
Thank you, Elliot. And Colin?
Hi. Yes, so I'm sure Fasni's memory is accurate, but I have to admit to not recalling the specific comment that she was referring to. I mean, for the record, I'm not waiting for any specific text changes to this document, and I'll let the chairs judge consensus. If I accidentally gave the impression that I was, then my apologies. That's certainly not the case.
Thank you, Colin. I was just treating it as another participant's viewpoints that needed to be taken into account. I wasn't assuming an IETF chair mandate, but thank you. Okay. Are we, so Gershabad, are you okay on this? And as I say, other people, let's continue this discussion on the list. The list gets deadly quiet sometimes, and then it flurries, and then it gets deadly quiet. So really, I would like to see this one resolved there as much as we can before Gershabad and Niels put out another version, which I hope is the one that we can take the last call. And I will be trying to check with people that made comments to see where they're at on the resolution of their comments.
Okay. If people now still have opinions, it would be great to hear them now, and then we can continue. But so we'll keep monitoring the chat. But it sounds now like we have pretty much what we want with Elliot's solution. So that's great.
Thank you, Niels. Yeah, I think we see the line. I don't know if we've crossed it yet.
And just quickly to follow
Thanks
up.
so much, Shiva.
Yes, Colin.
Quickly to follow up from looking at the chat, it seems that we were confusing Perkins's.
Oh.
All right.
Back to you, Mallory. I'll go invisible.
Great. My co-pilot and I would like to invite Niels. Niels, great. This is on draft association. We can see you, Niels, and your slides, and we can hear you. Go ahead.
So thanks so much. It is great that we're all here to talk about freedom of association. And it's nice after we've been talking about participation in groups that we now get to talk about the draft on association and the internet infrastructure. I've been working on this with Gisela Perez de Acha, with Stefan Couture, and with Mallory Nodal, which is funny because these are people who associate together with all different mother tongues, which is interesting. The objective for this dog is to expand and deepen relations between a specific right and protocols. And this is the explicit objective from the charter. And so a non-objective for this dog is to analyze specific protocols to do human rights impact assessment or to produce new guidelines, such as those done in the previous document. So a short summary of how we've been working on this. So we've been working on this since March 2017. So it has its 4 years anniversary. It has been a research group document since September 2018. And authors from academia and civil society and from different geographies and disciplines have contributed to it. And that also sometimes shifted the structure and the topic of the document, which sometimes made it a bit like a accordion, but it definitely made a good sound at times. And we had many reviews from many IRTF and IETF participants, as well as legal experts, and we actually might hear from some in a bit. So what happened since 06? We've been reading more literature and getting extensive reviews, which is great. Because this is a research group document, I think we need to keep in mind that we all have change control on this document. And so text suggestions are great, but if people say, go here, read these 10 papers and divide and get something from that I want, that is perhaps not the best way to approach a group document. And it would also be great if we can keep the threads linking to each other on the mailing list so we can keep track of the comments, and we cannot get anyone's useful and a very important contributions lost. So what we've been doing is address the full reviews. We make clearer distinctions between the rights to association and the right to assembly. We added recent decision documents and documents from relevant UN bodies. We added more context and nuance where there were unclarities. We added examples and concrete considerations and improved the conclusions. Then some proposed changes for our next version, because this week people have been emailing, and I think with some very good suggestions. So we should more clearly differentiate the right to assembly and right to association in the beginning, and then also provide the definitions for both rights. So I'd like to do that directly on top and show that they're different. Then we can discuss them in combination later, because then they are extended. And add an emphasis that the document is about human rights as per the Hrpc Charter and not their implementation in national laws. But I do think it is very relevant to get that stuff, but not maybe in this document, because then this document might never see the finish line. So that will be my proposal to go forward. And any comments and questions are extremely welcome.
I just wanted to make my own comment that I also agree that we need to point to possible future work. Niels, if you could mute, like national laws and applications, but that this document is really still in the baby stage, just trying to establish a key relationship so that future work has the ability to stand on top of this. That's like, it's incredibly important that we do all the things, but in sort of order. Yes, and then my second thing was to invite Lisa to talk, who's given a really great review and is engaging on the list currently as well. So go ahead, Lisa. You should be able to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hey, yes. Can you hear me well? Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm happy to contribute to this discussion, and was really happy to do a full review of the latest draft and contribute to the next draft. I'm very enthusiastic about the conclusions and the improvements, and there's still some improvements possible, as Niels just mentioned, based on like making the freedoms more explicitly different from each other. I had some thoughts that I wanted to share with you during this mission, maybe also sharing a little bit about the background for my contribution. So there were two aspects that we focused on at ICNL. I'm at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. I think I'm the only non-lawyer in that organization. So I have interesting discussions with my colleagues about freedoms of association and assembly and what falls within the scope and outside the scope. And what I try to do is to always keep in mind that very detailed legal texts are often pretty difficult and sometimes even scary to understand for non-legal people. So it's let's say that I had a discussion about how the paragraphs about freedom of association and freedom of assembly were written in this paper, and also related to the comments made by Professor Brahman, it is possible to really go in depth into these freedoms, but I'm not sure if it is really worthwhile for the goal of this paper, because it's important to make some of the disclaimers that is an ongoing discussion, especially how these rights apply in cyberspace, and how digitally mediated assemblies, what that is, for example, and how they should protect it. This is an ongoing discussion, and it's important to have the references to this discussion. But to really go to in-depth jurisprudence or interpretations in national laws, I'm not sure if that is really helpful to make the point in this paper. So because because I'm not a lawyer, I focus a little bit more on identifying and really updating the normative language that has been developed over the time, and pretty recently actually. So I think 4 years has been a great time to work on this, because you actually allowed the Human Rights Committee to come up with their general comments on freedom of assemblies. That was published end of last year, and they. This is really the latest authoritative text in terms of UN language that we should refer to in this paper, and that's what I try to include in the latest draft. So what I think is interesting, maybe for this call and to tap your knowledge, is that I wanted to highlight some of these general remarks by the Human Rights Committee that I haven't been able to understand completely whether they are related to something, whether they are related to protocol design or not. So I just wanted to highlight 3 different phrases from the general comments and ask whether you have anything to add to that. So the paper says, the general comment says, like, first it says, associated activities that happen online or otherwise rely upon digital services are protected. I think that is in general a very important notion, but still very general. It also says, technologies that offer the opportunity to assemble either wholly or partly online should be protected. And technologies that play an integral role in organizing, participating, and monitoring physical gatherings. So it's not. I'm not able to really translate that into protocol design. So if someone can also like highlight this, or maybe later in the email, that would be so welcome for me also to learn. And another important aspect of international human rights law, of course, is that the boundaries for restrictions on international law are formulated. So the general comments mention some of the restrictions that actually happen, but should be limited, that are not in line with the international law and with the tests that are developed for restriction. So they mention restrictions of operation of information dissemination systems. I think that's super generic and requires further thinking, but I was just wondering, how is this related to protocol design? And they also mention action that block or hinder internet connectivity in relation to peaceful assemblies. So is that really the opportunity to use your phone and share videos on online platforms, or is it something else, or really participate in a mailing list while you're at a protest or preparing a protest? I find that interesting to think about what it means and what it implicates for protocol design. It also has explicitly mentioned geo-targeted or technology-specific interference with connectivity or access to content, and activities of internet service providers and intermediaries that restrict assemblies or the privacy of assembly participants. So that's it for the legal language from me, and I'm just really happy to be here in this community now, and any further replies to this are super welcome, and I look forward to continue to work with the draft. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. This is exactly the sort of thing we need for HRPC drafts. It's like we really need reviews from outside the immediate sector and audience. Yeah, go ahead, Niels.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Lisa again, because the comments were just so good, and both in the document and now again, so we can take the definitions from there without using other sources, so that we can use authoritative human rights language from the source where we cite from. That's great, and that should definitely help make the next step for the document. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for commenting, and thanks so much for also conferring with your legal colleagues and making this document better. Thanks so much.
So putting my chair hat on for a second, because I authored part of this draft for a short amount of time, just wanting to make sure everything has been resolved. We obviously cannot, Sandra Brahman, who has written to the list a few times about this draft, isn't on the call, but I wanted to think about how to get to the point where we've resolved that, when I think a lot of those questions, again, okay, so putting my author hat on for a hot second, a lot of those suggestions feel very out of scope, taking my hat off again, like how to then actually resolve that. I just feel like it has sort of proven to be a bit of a endless back and forth where there's some cross talking every year on what do you think we should do?
Well, I don't think it's been going on long enough for it to be an endless discussion. And so I'm hoping to see a little bit more, discussion go on the list, especially when it gets a little further. I think, again, you're right. We'll have to do that division between what is actually directly pertinent to association. And I'm starting to think that somewhere or other I've got a shepherd's hat for taking this through its last call, since you're an author, but have that, but we're not quite there yet. So I think there's room for some further discussion. I think some of the new input that's come in is really great. And so I think this one is starting to get close, but I do think there's this more discussion. And as I said, I think there's still the division between what is the theoretical background and how much of that needs to be in this sort of first big work on the association theme.
Well, for maybe we can just discuss like one of the most recent ones that Neil's also talked about in the slides. It's like, here are 10 primary source documents that might inform you. I feel like Stefan and others did a very comprehensive lit review already that spanned 6 to 12 months. So if there's that much source material that we're missing, I actually think we need to get to the heart of the comment and start another document, because it cannot be, I feel, that we've missed so very much and are still within the same scope of the same document. I think the reason why it appears that we've missed so much is that there's a vision for this document that is different from what the authors have envisioned. And that's totally fine. That happens all the time. And it's actually a gift, because in some ways we've got the beginnings of another piece of research for Hrpc to work on. But again, because this is like trying to, establish a sort of baseline relationship that it does not exist elsewhere as a real contribution to the space, I think we should keep it to achieving that very one clear goal that's in our charter, trying to make that as solid as it can be to indicate other peripheral work and then follow that work from the beginning properly.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think it's probably, and I very much take Niels's comment of, don't tell me to go read these 10 books, but, give me some specific text, give me some specific pointers for where something that, as you say, fits within the context. It's really fun seeing her in the background. I keep smiling and wanting to wave hello. But so I think
it's fine.
But I think that trying to get that line, because it is a research group document, of where exactly is the constraining line on this document and the beginning line on another, is still, at least for me, a little fuzzy. So I'd really like to try, and I'd really like to hear from some other people, and I'm so glad to see Elliot's name show up. But one thing before we go there, we had any other business topic on the list that we're not going to get to on the agenda, and I'm going to suggest, and especially since Sandra's not here anyway, I'm going to suggest an interim meeting. So let's not worry about that. Elliot.
Yeah, I think part of the issue to address the point that Mallory just made, that there are different visions. The IRTF was established to allow for that. It's perfectly fine to have different conflicting visions, in fact. And I think that's okay. But what I think I have to come back to what a few of us have been scratching our heads about. There's no need for these documents, if there's conflicting visions, there's no need for them to be consensus documents. Right? It's a perfectly reasonable thing to go forward with without going for that strong consensus. You're not under the IETF constraints, and you shouldn't tie your hands in that way. Is my view. If people want to disagree, it's okay, as long as the work is of a certain level of scholarly, standard. If it meets the scholarship standard, good. If it's missing the scholarship standard, that's more of an issue. But if people have different points of view and they're expressing it through good scholarly work, just let 1,000 blossoms, go, as they say. Grow. I see no reason to hold this document up beyond that point. Just so long as we're clear that it's not going to be a consensus document, and I think that's something that will help you guys advance.
Elliot, if I can, I think there's a differentiation between two things. One is, what is the purpose of the document and how far do we go in it? And the other is differences of opinion on particular points that are included in the document. I think everyone pretty much accepts your view that the document itself doesn't need to be a consensus opinion, but we do need to reach a certain amount of consensus about the scope of the document that the research group, so it doesn't end up an encyclopedia. It ends up a document directed towards a specific point. And I think those two issues are a little different, but happy to keep talking to you about that one on the list. Colin, please.
I don't know how many buttons I'm pressing. I'm really not trying to share my screen here. I mean, I do think Elliot made some good points there. I mean, that some documents are consensus documents, and it's important that they're consensus documents. And other documents cannot be consensus documents and can express a minority view, but provided it's clear what the document is, and provided it's a well-reasoned, well-argued view. I think the other comment I think I want to make was if a document gets such quite extensive feedback, like it did, and the authors then turn around and say, well, that's all great, but it's out of scope. Then that perhaps suggests that that it's not clear what the scope of the document is, maybe the scope of the document should expand to include that feedback. Or maybe the scope should be clarified, just so everyone sort of looks at it and says, that's fine, but it's not for this document. So I think just saying that's fine, but it's out of scope may be okay, but it would, I think, need some extensive, perhaps moderately extensive changes to the document to make the scope clearer. Or it should be addressing those comments.
Thanks. Mallory,
yeah, I'm in the queue as an author, so I think that it would be useful. I totally agree with you, Colin. I think I said before, like, it's to say it's out of scope isn't enough. Like, we should try to figure out a way to point to other research. I think before we can incorporate a sentence or a paragraph of that in the current draft, I mean, we can definitely strengthen the scope, but then in terms of like leading to other drafts, we would need, I think, someone, if not Sandra herself, to step in and try to summarize what would the research question of that other document be. I cannot, as co-author or co-chair of the group, find the time to help make that document happen. So it's a call and a request to the group to distill what's been shared into a very clear research question that leads into another document in such a way that we can point to that future work in the draft that we have now, and to set it up so that it can then get knocked down, right? And that's what I hope we can do, but I just feel like I can't personally make that happen. And I mean, if we can direct Sandra to do it, that'd be great, but I suspect that we also need other folks who maybe yet haven't helped author drafts in HRPC, or if I saw comments to Sandra's emails where they found them very enlightening and that's taught them a lot. And especially if it's going to focus on national laws, like to get folks actually based in nations where we're going to be taking cues from them, that would be really helpful to be co-authors and to try to actually make this happen. So I think that's where we should go with this to try to resolve the current association draft. So I'm done now.
Thanks. And obviously, since you're an author and a co-chair, I'll have to take more responsibility to try and enable that. Lisa and Niels, Lisa next, then Niels, and we have 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'll keep it short. In terms of the scope and the goal of the paper, I think it can be strengthened by really, I'm not sure if that's possible, but COVID-19 has showed that every kind of form of association and assembly has this very important online aspect to it, much more than, for example, 2 or 3 or 4 years ago now. So it can be, this really heightens the relevance of the paper, and I think it's important to really strengthen. That was also one of the points by Sandra Berman, to really strengthen the examples and tie them to what is actually protected under international human rights law and what is not. And to also really present a disclaimer that this is not a finalized discussion, because it's not. But it's good to have a point in time where there's really more awareness and more guidelines and conclusions for people working on the internet architecture that are maintaining this super important digital infrastructure that we know to continue assembling and convening in digital time. So thank you.
Thank you. And Niels, you get the last word on this topic today.
Thanks so much. I think Juliana made a great point in the chat. This is part of an interdisciplinary conversation, which is always challenging. But what I think it's even more, it's part of a very long discussion of which some people that came in at the end have not been part. And we really spent a long time on building consensus in the group on what this scope of this document should be. Then we completely reorganized it and worked on it for a long and hard time with Stefan, with students, with binding cases, with building the research structure. And then we had consensus on it. And now Sandra came in and would like to change it, which I think is great, but that makes the discussion and the process also a bit problematic. So I fully agree that we should try to make the scope of this document clearer, put the definition at the beginning and what it does and what it doesn't do. And then I really hope that we can have another document that further discussions on implementations and then combining guidelines and other stuff. But I think we should also try to keep our output going, because it also keeps it inciting for people to work on stuff. And I do hope that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to help with that. And I turn it back to you, Mallory, for the last 3 minutes.
I don't even think I'll take 3, but Niels makes a really important point, which is that we actually, one of the ways that we decided to work on this draft was to be genuinely curious and to conduct research, to answer questions that we didn't know the answers to yet. And that is what has led to this draft. And I think the reason why we aren't including national laws and things that Sandra is because from the beginning, we didn't look there. When we said we're going to first conduct a lit review, and then we're going to come up with sub-questions, and then we're going to answer those sub-questions with examples and analysis, we, from the beginning, limited ourselves to human rights and international human rights law. So that's why it's not there. And I can totally understand why there are some very curious questions and itches that need to be scratched that touch on this issue. And I'm so glad that this draft has inspired those questions, but they just simply are not what we set out to do. And I think just reminding that, and then as a way to, facilitate then that research that has been inspired by this draft, like we just need to make that happen. And I'm really invested in doing that as a chair. So I think then the end is near. We had a really great session. Huge appreciation to all of the presenters, the authors, the discussants. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Avri. Yeah, have a really good rest of your IETF 110. Maybe we'll see you in San Francisco. Probably we'll still see you online, at least some of you. So yeah, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
The last thing I want to add is out on the list, scheduling an intermediate meeting so that we can get into the discussion of continuing work and what work is on our list. Some of the stuff in Sandra's message that was quite good. Some of the stuff that comes out of the 2 drafts we've talked about of what the next step is in those discussions. So again, thank you all, and you'll be hearing from me.